Okay, getting right into it. Okay, this year's had some interesting tax cases, and without getting into it, I see some interesting trends happening that we'll discuss. With the kind of tightening of the SR&ED tax credit system over the last 3 to 4 years, what I've experienced or seen in today's cases tend to support kind of my hypothesis here that the rules are tightening. However, a lot of the companies that are getting refused, in my opinion, are companies that are doing relevant SR&ED. And some of the companies that are still getting accepted are companies that shouldn't be accepted. And I have my own ideas on why that's happening. But I'm going to illustrate this by talking about some of the court cases. And hopefully that, as more and more cases come to bear at court, this is going to settle out and we're going to get a good series of precedents that we can avoid additional problems. So the first series deal with technology cases. And, generally it's technology issues. Some issues like keeping or destroying records could be financial or technical, depending how you look at it, but we'll call it technical for now because it's primarily technical records. And we're going to talk about different cases. We'll look at the fact scenario. When they come to court, what were the key issues? Not only did they win or lose, but why did they win or lose? What are the implications? Are there any implications we can take as advisors to claim preparers to avoid the problems or to capitalize on the opportunities that are exemplified here? Okay, so we're going to go through each of them. Ben Mack, one of our patent advisors and one of our partners in the R&D-based group, has been helping me quite a bit in developing what we call the prior art search tool. So we're going to talk about that. And that appears to be one of the weaknesses, doing a prior art search or due diligence or benchmarking existing technology, whatever you want to call it, on the claims that are unsuccessful. Okay. As I mentioned, I welcome anyone to ask questions. We've got a very generous time frame this time around. Okay. So the first of the cases that I'm going to talk about is called Highweb and Page. It's a software case where they were developing in Java and .NET. One of the key things that I think is relevant to look at on each of these cases is how much money are we dealing with? Are we dealing with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of dollars? And that appears to make a big difference. Claims that have certain characteristics, they're small. The principal investigators don't have formal training. They don't have bachelor of science degrees or formal designations behind them. Okay? I would argue they can do very good R&D, but they're still not going to qualify. It doesn't seem to matter what they do. They can't claim SR&ED. And I'm going to argue that people with PhDs and PEngs, based on recent cases, don't have to keep any evidence, and they're going to be granted the credit. So again, I'm seeing a trend that's maybe not in a direction that's in everyone's interest, but we'll talk about these. So in this case, it was a bit of a mixed one, that the client had roughly $60,000 of expenses refused and $2,700, actually I think those are credits, sorry, allowed. I forget if they're credits or expenses, but relatively small amount. And really what they said is there's no documentation of hypothesis or conclusions. And they didn't really give a lot of details in this case to go on. So the pattern, and this is a pattern that you can see of all the cases that lost, and this is a very good pattern, is that in each case where the taxpayer lost, the CRA reviewer or technology advisor gave specific instances of where the solution to the problem, that was allegedly the technology problem, would have been available. Okay? And more importantly, in each of these cases, the client did not refute that argument. They didn't say, no, this is a great starting point, what you mentioned, but this can't solve our problem because of some other technical variables. They kind of threw up their hands and left it there. Okay? So in this case, the reviewer said that they're trying to find an operating system that the application is running on. was one of their problems, and they're saying there's well-known techniques to do this, okay? Which may be true, but the client didn't refute that that technique couldn't work here, or there was a problem with that. Okay? And that's really the difference. So had the client been able to come in and say, well, you know, this is why that particular method won't work here, that would have been a different story. We're not seeing that in this situation. They talk about C# and Java porting and migrating. Again, these are common issues where there's tools, and he basically, the reviewer said there's books, there's all kinds of articles written, and the client didn't go in and take any of those articles and benchmark them and say, here's 4 or 5 techniques that might work, and here's our hypothesis about why one might work better than another. So again, what they're missing is 1, formal technical backgrounds of the developers. This is becoming more and more important. And I think that the other cases we're going to look at are going to illustrate this even more so. And the strike on all of the ones that lost is they didn't do enough due diligence. The courts have said there's no advancement, and really they didn't benchmark standard practice. They didn't say why readily available techniques couldn't achieve the objectives. And if you, I call that the square. Are we thinking outside the box? If you don't define the box, that's your foundation. You've really got nothing to build on now. Okay. The judge gave us some great directions, though. They said that to determine if it's SR&ED, they need the client, the claimant, to provide them records to show the deductive process from to evaluate different directions, speeds, or modes, to create, locate, size, and arrange. He's illustrating the kinds of variables. He said, if you could have showed me that you were experimenting with these kinds of variables, I could have given you the money, but you didn't. Okay? So again, the claimant didn't benchmark technology, and they didn't, when the CRA came in and said, hey, you should be able to use these existing technologies or books to do it, and everything's in here, they didn't refute that argument. They didn't say, no, there's information missing in this. This is a good start, but it's incomplete. So again, how could we deal with this or prevent it? And part of what we're doing, and this is where I'm starting to work with Ben, is to recognize that when we look at the international definition of SR&ED, and it really is an international definition, it's pretty much the same around the world, and really it can be summarized as the scientific method. Okay? You have objectives, hypothesis, analysis, results, conclusions. And what's beautiful about that method is it's universal. I can talk to people from any country or any continent in any language, and when I say scientific method, they know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not that South America has a different science. No, objectives, hypothesis, analysis, results, conclusions. So again, when we apply that framework here, if we work with that, we're going to be fine. One of the best ways I'm saying then to look at whether there's a technological advancement is to look at, well, what are the international definitions for that? And that's where we lead to patents. Patents are probably the highest level of technological. You have to have technological advancement, really, to achieve a utility patent. So we're not talking about what something looks like, a design patent, but a utility, how something works and the method to make it work that way. So we've been working with Ben and saying, really, each of the cases that have lost, that have otherwise had experimentation and seem to have semi-qualified people, what's been the underlying problems? And what I'd like to do, so I'm going to open up some software where I've done a quick little review. So I'll go to R&D base and just hit the demo login. Okay, and I'm looking at their fiscal 2013 taxation year. Let's go 2014. Okay, so I'm going to look at each of the cases that we're going to talk about today within this framework. So the Highweb and page case on web crawler development has various objectives, things along that nature.
Sorry, Dave, what was the project number? I'm sorry.
Project number on that, is, I believe it's 1403. 1403, web crawler development. Okay, so one of the key things that we're going to look at is, I like to call it a key criteria summary for the project. Is there anything missing, major missing? So step one, did we benchmark standard practice? Did we talk about any existing techniques? And if so, how did we do it? Did we do internet searches? Did we find articles, patents, competitive products, talk to experts. What are all the things, and how many of those did we do? Does anyone have an idea? How much of that should you do? How much due diligence should you do? Well, of course, just say a reasonable amount. That's where it gets dicey. So we're applying judgment. What may be reasonable to me or you may not be reasonable to a CRA reviewer. But I think if you use reasonable judgment, the judges are very reasonable. If you did nothing, like in the case here, apparently they didn't provide any evidence of due diligence. So really important when you go to court, it's not necessarily just what you say, it's what you can prove. So if you've done the due diligence and you bring the evidence of the due diligence, that's going to go a long way. So if you actually had done all these and you brought that kind of benchmark evidence, the client probably would have won here. Okay? The second thing is, did you have quantifiable objectives? Because the tax courts say over and over again that systematic investigation involves extremely accurate measurements. They say without such analysis and measurement, systematic investigation cannot exist. Okay? You don't want to say things are better or stronger or whatever. You have to provide finite measurements to everything. So that's good. So do we have objectives? And do we have results? And it's usually the objectives that stack up together, that no one objective is a problem, but if I have to get this response time with this precision by only using this much memory, and maybe cost constraints and something, when I put all those together, that's what creates the problem. Now I can't use certain technology. Now I can't use certain devices. I have to replace it. How am I going to deal with that? And then very importantly, we talked about this earlier, the courts generally say that to illustrate uncertainty, they want to understand the variables that the individual chose for experimentation. And they use this term over and over again. Problem I'm finding with Canada Revenue Agency and the directives is they use the term uncertainty, technological uncertainty. And people don't understand what that means. If I talk to 10 different people, I'll get 10 different variations of what does that really mean. And I say that it's not only with claimants, but also with reviewers. There's a lot of discrepancy at every level of what is technological uncertainty. And I've been talking about this 20 years, and I don't know if that's ever going to get solved other than what the courts are saying, which is that generally something comes from a predictive model. You have a model for everything. That's the science. If you want to create this process, you put pressure at 7, and you put the temperature at 5 and whatever. So you have an X, Y, and Z set of variables that you're going to adjust. And if I change the temperature, then the optimal pressure may change and vice versa. Called a system uncertainty. So I change one component and it may change the upstream or downstream process. So what we like to do, or what I recommend that people do to illustrate the uncertainty is talk about what are all the existing predictive models to tell us how something's going to work. And they're usually some kind of mathematical model in almost every field of science. If those predictive models answer our question, then they're right. That's routine engineering or standard practice or all the other terms that are in there that lack technological advancement. However, if we can start to identify variables that we say we have models that give us an idea on where to start, but they certainly don't answer our question, right? And that particularly they rely on assumptions of other variables. If I change that, there's an unpredictable upstream or downstream effect that's not readily outlined in the existing model. Then we have the existence of system uncertainty. And what I found the most useful thing to do is, in any field of science, is to get the team as early as possible in the development process to agree on what are the top 3 to 5 variables, the things that we could control as developers, that we can make a choice to do this or do that we've made that choice that will help us achieve those outcomes. And keep it really simple. What are the things I could control in order to achieve the objectives? The reality is there's an infinite number of things I could do, right? But I don't have time to do them. What are the top 5? Use those and rank them. Use your professional judgment to rank those in order of importance and significance, and then to be able to successfully argue that this combination of variables is not predicted in any existing model. And if you can do that, that's technological advancement. And it's very objective. This is what the court and the judges are asking for over and over. Anyone who can provide this wins every time. The people who lose are missing usually one of those 2 components, or both components. Okay? Now, So the last part is, did we have conclusions? But also, what did we do? How many alternatives did we look at? What methods did we use? And then did that correlate with the cost? So you'd have some cost correlation that looks reasonable based on what you've done. So this is kind of whatever you want to call it, key criteria summary, snapshot, overview. This is something that if you use a sieve like this, you can start to identify weak points. So this is where I'll look at something like this, and if there's blanks or if there's something I say, well, this is more of a marketing problem than a technology problem, then I'm going to drill into the description and maybe I'll read more about what happened and if this needs to be updated. But I'd say that most of the problems can be identified at a very high level. Okay? Now,
so is it ever taken as obvious?
Pardon me?
Rather than describing it, is it ever taken as the obvious, something is that obvious that is improved?
If something's obvious, sorry, what was the question?
If something is obvious that it is a definite improvement, do you still have to prove?
If something is obvious but it's a definite improvement, do you have to prove?
Yeah, if you don't have the numbers, if you just...
Oh, okay, I understand. So the question is, how important is quantifying the objectives? Would that be a way to... I would say you can get away with not doing it, but if you can, it's going to help. The courts are the ones who say you need extremely accurate measurements and analysis of the measurements. So if you're not quantifying things, how are you going to measure them? There's a court saying you have to do this, right? I'm saying to provide the courts with what they want, this is the easiest roadmap. Now, could you be successful with leaving 1, 2, 3, 4 part? Yeah, sadly you can, but every weakness in here is it's kind of like a bridge where you're weakening it. You may still be able to get across, but at some point it's going to collapse. What we're trying to do is build something that's a little more bulletproof, that's going to withstand those tests.
But if you look into disruptive technology, then it's completely different from what was before.
This is a great point. So the argument here is, and this is the one that I hear a lot, what if something's disruptive technology? Now, it should have been in our course earlier because we dealt with that. So we talk about Thomas Edison, who invented the phonograph. No one had ever recorded sound up till that point, and supposedly he was the first. It's debatable whether he really was, but he was the first guy to patent it. So let's go with that. He took a wax tube, he put a filter on it, and realized that if he spoke into it, the vibrations would play back. He did this at 8 in the morning, and you can go to the Smithsonian, they had it patented by 2 in the afternoon. And that was a technological advancement. No one ever recorded sound. We'll agree, that's a great advancement. But most of those Eureka-type breakthroughs are not big SR&ED projects. Okay? We've got, what, Tom, 2 staff, 8 in the morning till, what, 10 man hours? 12? Okay, so you get credit on 12 man hours. But it's done, that project's finished. If you listen,
So it wouldn't have qualified.
well, if you listen to music or stuff, I bet you don't buy it on wax tubes anymore, right? A lot of people spend a lot more than 10 or 12 hours to say, hey, let's put this flat. Let's spin it at different RPMs. Hey, let's use lasers to read it. Let's get rid of the disk altogether and put it on different... Okay, billions, trillions of dollars have gone into that. The technology already exists. Incrementally improving it in some measurable way is the difference. Okay? The courts have said that most incremental improvements are infinitesimally small incremental improvements over existing technology. That's 99.9% of the industrial R&D. And then the Eureka phonograph type examples are really great for getting on the front of magazines and what people love to talk about, but they're not the lion's share of what we're dealing with. And it's that misunderstanding in industry that I'd say is often the problem. So things that are revolutionary, the lure or the mistake is to say that because something is new, there's nothing that's ever been even remotely similar, right? And that assumption may be wrong, because if there was ever anything that existed that was remotely similar, different but remotely similar, you should be accounting for that in your standard practice. Here's something that's remotely similar that gives me an idea of what may or may not work. Okay? Then you're in. So I'd say that there is no question I could ever imagine, even time travel included, that you wouldn't have to benchmark some level of standard practice or previous theories or something to try to get ideas on where to go. All right, so let's talk about how do I do a prior art search. So what we would normally do is say an overview, what are the top criteria, give a verbal summary of the hypothesis, and then let's just keep going, right? And then when we have the criteria outlined, this is probably a weaker one, but we'll start with this one. We'll build up some stronger ones. Once I have these criteria outlined, what are the key variables that we're dealing with? And I communicate that to my development team. It actually makes the process a lot easier. So we'll have our meeting and we'll say, okay, anytime anyone deals with any of these variables, make some notes on it, because that could be helping our group understand that variable better, which would be a technological advancement. Okay? So all of your time would be in. So the question is, what kind of things, how do I start the prior art search? That's really the real question here. Because once I start my prior art search and I show there's a problem that I don't think I've done a reasonable search and I don't think I can answer it, officially that's my birth certificate of the project. The minute I can say, here's the 7 variables that I've done a reasonable amount of searching and I can't find a solution, although I can get some ideas on which way I might want to go, but I can't find a definitive solution, that's where we should start the SR&ED project. So if I were to look at 400 patents, the question is any of that cost in? Let's say it took me 2 weeks. How many people say it's not?
Yeah.
How many people say it is?
Yeah.
How many people say maybe?
Oh.
I'd go with the maybe. I would say that, let's say I looked at 5 or 50 patents just to get general ideas. But after the 50th patent, I knew I had problems with 5 different variables. That none of them were, that they had different ideas, but none of them were conclusive on these 5 variables. And then I looked at 350 more patents to understand how those patents dealt with 1 or more of those variables. You could argue that now that I've got the 5 variables, looking at the data analysis and data collection that I'm doing related to those 350 other patents, now that I've stated what the problem is, it's applied research. It's all in. When the CRA reviews this, usually they'll ask you questions like, what was the day, and I'll say that, what day did you first determine the uncertainty or phrase the uncertainty? And that's how they say it, phrase the uncertainty. How do you do that? Well, here's the day where I determined 3 or more variables that I can't find any predictive model that will tell me what to do with those variables. In fact, I found different models perhaps that say to do different things that are conflicting models. How do I know which one? That are all standard practice. When I can create uncertainty like that, I have conflicting issues, I have to experiment with it, that's very strong evidence of technological uncertainty. Particularly we're using a model. The model is the standard practice. I use SolidWorks software to tell me what resin to use and what flow rates, but it doesn't work here because the resin I'm using is just invented yesterday and there's nothing like it. But it's similar to some other resins. It has some of these performance characters. So I can predict how it might work. Okay? I can take some similar ones and say it might work like this, it might work like that. Beautiful SR&ED project. So again, leading back to my question, how do I start my search? What questions do I ask to get started? And what I'd argue is, that's the hardest part. Once you get started, and I'll show you how that Google prior art search works, and I'm working with clients, it's actually very powerful that once you get something similar, you can use that item to start to zero in on every similar item. Okay, so what am I talking about? This is something that I've been working with Ben on the patent side to understand how can I leverage, first it was just patents, but Google's actually expanded to all prior art, which is really kind of cool, to say, how do I start my search? And I'm saying that, what would you put in Google to find a search on something? I'm saying it's usually, I looked with a lot of clients and how they would do their searches, and it's always a combination of the project name itself, develop a new whatever, the objectives, and the variables. Some combination of those word terms. So let's say that we wanted to do a web crawler here, and we had issues on precision and memory use, just to start. And we could pick whatever ones that we think are the major ones, the most significant. And we'll start our search. And what this does is it takes you into the Google prior art search engine. Okay? Now the first thing I do is, you're usually not going to put tax case Highweb in there, right? Just because I put it because it's a tax case, you'd put whatever your thing was. So why don't we just change this to web development, web crawler. Okay? Now what this is I call it a top 50 list. The top 10 scholarly articles, the top 10 patents, the top 10 web hits, that's if you just use Google on its own, what would the web show you? The top 10 books that deal with that combination of terms, and the top 10 people who write about that combination of terms. So I may want to use any of those, or just the general one. What I often do, because patents represent technological advancement, is I'll start with them. And I'll say, is there anything similar in here? I say, well, you know what, maybe this apparatus for data data race detection. I got races, it's causing deadlocks or spin locks or whatever in my data. I'm going to take a look at what they did in here, and it's 2009. So maybe there's something similar. So usually you can go through and see what the claims are, see what diagrams they have, if it's similar to your environment or not. If it is, skim through. All of your key terms are going to be highlighted. So all of the search terms, you can skim through and try to find out what are they doing related to what I'm talking about. What I then like to do is go right to the bottom of the patent. So this is a big sucker. Holy smokes. Okay. What's going to happen at the bottom is they'll tell you, here's all the patents that happened before it that it referenced. So they would have something similar. And here's all the patents that happened after that referenced it. So theoretically, they would have something similar. And what I'm saying, once you start the search, you can often come in and start to look at different citations and say, well, you know what, this detecting race conditions is similar, or whatnot. You may find 3 or 4 more articles. And then going in them, you may find additional articles. So, you know, one links to another, links to another. What I found is very quickly, usually within 10 minutes, you'll probably find 5 to 10 documents that are very, very close to what you're talking about. In some cases, they may even answer your question, which is great. Hey, you didn't waste your money doing R&D on something where the answer was readily available. That's the ultimate scenario. Or they don't give you the answer. Maybe they give you a few ideas that you hadn't thought of, but they support that there is no answer. And when you go to court and they ask for the due diligence or the prior art search or whatever, you've got one. Okay? Now, the CRA reviewer has the position of refuting that you didn't do enough due diligence or that the answer is out there. Okay? In the United States, the IRS has something called a rebuttal presumption, which means if an IRS reviewer, technical reviewer, wants to refute a IRS R&D claim, they don't only have to say, I think it was standard practice, they have to show you exactly the method and where it was in public practice that you missed and could have used to solve it. Their opinion that it should have been out there is not enough. They have to use science to do it. They have to prove it, not think it. Okay? All that matters is what they can prove, not what they think. All right. So the last part, so that's step 2. So I find information in the patent itself, search the prior art at the bottom, and then lastly, if I like this patent, yeah.
Dave, you said that's the way they do it in the US.
Correct.
And CRA?
Well, when I talk to people like Russ Roberts at CATA in Ottawa, he says that the design of the system contemplates that. That's how it's intended to work in Canada, but it doesn't. Okay? I'm hoping at some point we could raise it to that level, because that's the way it should be in my opinion, but I don't think it works like that. That's why we have these meetings, that maybe at some point if enough people express that opinion, or more importantly, if the tax courts say that's the way it must be, which is what the tax courts are doing, then that's the ultimate authority. So I think it does work that way, but sadly, the group administering the program is not in line with the criteria as much as the tax courts are, or I guess the ultimate administrators. Okay, so the final part, I search through the patent to find something. I search through the citings, both before and after, to see if there's any links that look interesting to me. And if I like this patent, so this is how I generate the new search terms. This is where the Google prior art is really neat. I hit find prior art, and it erases all my other terms, and it says, here's all the tags that were in that patent that they thought were significant. Okay? So I may say, hey, you know what? Object-oriented programming is important. Precision is important, but not so much. And multi-threading is important. Okay? Or I can add more terms. But again, I can start to very quickly zero in my search to find ideas on every issue, every objective, and every variable that I've stated. And maybe start to combine variables. How did these people deal with combining these 4 variables? Once I get those ideas, the question is, how much due diligence is reasonable? This is where I'd have to say, well, what are you doing with it? Are you doing an SR&ED claim? How much is reasonable? Well, that's up to a judge. You know, are we doing a patent claim? Depends how much your patent's worth. You know, at that point, you might want to go a little more exhaustive. And that's where someone like Ben could come in and advise you or help you with those searches. But ultimately, if you take this first step, I'm saying you've got a great method to ascertain that you did benchmark standard practice. And the cases that have lost have never done this. So you go through each one of them, none of them have a benchmark, none of them have done anything remotely close to this. And therefore the judge said that based on the evidence provided, they thought it was routine engineering. Because the evidence didn't show that it wasn't. This is how you show it's not routine engineering. That you're saying this is everything in the world that we can access through Google. I mean, not everything in the world. Google will access, what, 40% of the internet? But that 40%, if I can't find it on there, it's probably not readily available to me. And the judge would probably side on that. Okay. All right. Then the last thing is we want to upload all these documents. Okay, so how many internet searches did we do? How many patent searches? How many articles? So at some point we may say, well, here's a patent and we've saved it. And we might want to annotate it, put some marks on it. Here's what's same, here's what's different. Mark it up however we want. Scan it, then save it. So we'd upload that document. And then we'd say which of the variables it relates to. How relevant is it? Is it 40% relevant? It's kind of an idea, but probably more. Or is it 100? Hey, this is the answer, 100%. I found the answer to my question. Or again, these are judgment calls because what I actually found is that when you use this, you can very quickly start to amass 100 to 300 patents, analyze all of them quickly, really quickly. It gets overwhelming. Then you need some system to rank them and kind of focus on stuff before you get overwhelmed. Okay, any questions on that? So you would upload it, and then you would have it available at the end. Okay? We'll illustrate that again with maybe some of the other cases. Yes, Harvey?
When you upload it, you make sure that you've got
Oh.
your headers and footers there so that you know exactly the dates.
Yes.
It provides good evidence.
Let me show you one other thing. Sorry, I wanted to... so the last part is uploading your research logs. So at the end of the day, what I want to do is not only download my activities to establish prior art, but also talk about what I did and record my research. So I'll talk about my experiments, how many experiments I did, what results, if any, I had, what conclusions I had, how they relate to the variables in question. And ideally, I'm going to upload documents. So I can upload, here's all my research steps, here's my test results, you're going to have everything right there online chronologically. What I like to do is see Highweb in here, in the case, actually gave an appendix. So this is the development log that they brought to court. I'm saying, if you're going to go to court on these issues, you're going to need more evidence than this. This is not going to cut it. Okay? So they gave a log talking about the different phases, what their advancement claimed was, and really what the CRA response was. So again, the client tended to lose here. But these are great to look at to show people that, look, the client lost, but really they didn't go into court with the right information. That if you walk into court with information like this, you're going to lose big. And you should. And you should, because there is no uncertainty here. Nothing that they've provided really illustrates the evidence of any uncertainty other than the one activity allowed by the minister. And they talk about incompatibility between their product and some kind of mapping function in different operating systems. So maybe the government was easy on that. Even this one, they don't give us a lot of information on what the real issues were. Okay? So again, the clients who aren't qualifying at this point, it's often because of the due diligence. So step one, how do we prevent that?